Dr. Marcus Webb had spent 17 years listening to the forest, and the forest had never lied to him. Wolves spoke in hierarchies. Elk bugled their desperation during the rut. Even the Clark's nutcrackers cached their secrets in patterns he could map. But the recording Bill Tanner brought into his lab on that October morning in 1998 was something else entirely. Something that made the hairs on his forearms stand at attention before his conscious mind understood why. "Found it on my game camera audio," Bill said, setting the cassette on Marcus's desk with the care of a man handling live ordnance. 3 nights running, same spot, same time, around 2 a.m. Marcus's office at the Olympic Field Research Station smelled of spruce resin and old coffee. Rain drummed against the window overlooking the Hoh River Valley, where fog clung to the Sitka spruces like burial shrouds. He picked up the cassette, noting the label written in Bill's cramped handwriting, Site 7, Hoh Rainforest, Oct. 12 to 14, 98. "And you haven't played this for anyone else?" Bill shook his head. His weathered face carried the peculiar expression of a man who'd seen something that didn't fit into the catalogue of the known world. "You're the sound guy. You tell me what I'm hearing." Marcus slid the tape into his Marantz deck, analog still because digital compression could hide artifacts he needed to hear, and pressed play. For the first 30 seconds, there was only the ambient chorus of the rainforest at night, the distant percussion of the river, the occasional rustle of a small mammal, the soft hooting of a northern spotted owl. Then it began. The vocalization started low, a subsonic rumble that Marcus felt in his sternum before his ears properly registered it. Then it rose, cycling through a melodic structure that was unmistakably intentional. Not random, not territorial display. This had phrasing. It had repetition with variation. It had what linguists called prosodic contour, the rise and fall of pitch that signaled meaning. And underneath it, barely audible, there was a response. Higher pitched, shorter phrases, following the pattern but simpler, like a child learning a nursery rhyme. Marcus's hand froze on the volume knob. His heart rate accelerated. He could feel his pulse in his temples. He rewound the tape and played it again, this time routing it through his oscilloscope. The waveforms bloomed across the screen in patterns that made his breath catch. "What am I looking at?" Bill asked. Marcus's voice came out rougher than he intended. "Duetting, call and response. Adult and juvenile, if I had to guess." He zoomed in on a particular frequency band. "See this? The fundamental frequency is way below human range, around 60 hertz, but the harmonics are complex, structured. There's intentionality in the timing." "English, Doc." Marcus looked up from the screen, and for a moment he couldn't find the words. How do you tell someone that the impossibility they've suspected for years might be real, that the thing people laugh about around campfires might be singing lullabies to its young in the darkness of the ancient forest? "It's a song," he said finally. "Someone is singing to someone else, and they're singing back." The protocol was clear, even if the situation wasn't. Marcus spent the next 48 hours in methodical documentation. He made digital copies at multiple sample rates. He ran the audio through every analytical filter in his arsenal: spectrographic analysis, pitch tracking, rhythm extraction, formant analysis. He compared the vocalizations to his extensive library of known primate calls: gorilla chest beats, chimpanzee pant hoots, orangutan long calls. There were similarities in the use of infrasound, in the way low frequencies could travel through dense forest, but the melodic complexity was unlike anything in his database. The songs, he'd started thinking of them as songs, despite himself, consisted of phrases roughly 8 to 12 seconds long, repeated with subtle variations. The adult voice would sing a phrase, pause. The juvenile would respond with a compressed version of the same phrase. Then the adult would continue with a new phrase, building on the previous one. It had the structure of pedagogy, of transmission, of culture. On the third night, Marcus drove out to Site 7 with his own equipment, A Crown SAS stereo microphone array, a Sound Devices 744T recorder, and a parabolic reflector for directional capture. Bill had marked the location on a USGS map, a small clearing beside Owl Creek, where a massive Sitka spruce had fallen years ago and created a gap in the canopy. The game camera was still there, strapped to a hemlock 20 yards from the log. Marcus set up his gear with the practiced efficiency of 2 decades in the field. He positioned the SAS array on a low tripod near the log, aimed toward the densest part of the forest. The parabolic dish he mounted on a second tripod, angled slightly upward to catch any vocalizations from the canopy. Both fed into the 744T, recording at 96 kHz 24-bit, far beyond what human hearing required, but necessary to capture the full frequency spectrum of whatever was making these sounds. Then he settled into his canvas camp chair, wrapped himself in a wool blanket against the October chill, and waited. The forest settled around him. Rain had stopped at dusk, leaving everything dripping and alive with the smell of decay and growth intertwined. A barred owl called from somewhere to the north, "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" And Marcus smiled despite his nervousness. He'd spent countless nights alone in wild places, but this felt different. This felt like standing at the edge of a threshold he might not be able to cross back over. The singing started at 1:47 a.m. It came from the northwest, perhaps 200 yards into the forest. The subsonic throb arrived first, a pressure Marcus felt in his chest cavity before the melody emerged. Through his closed-back headphones, the sound was clearer than on Bill's cassette, and more heartbreaking. Because now, with high-quality recording equipment and his full attention, Marcus could hear the other thing woven into the adult's song: grief. He'd heard it before in the long calls of mother elephants who'd lost calves, in the vocalizations of captive orcas separated from their pods, even in the distress calls of crows mobbing a dead companion. This was that same tonal quality, the acoustic signature of loss. The juvenile responded, and Marcus's throat tightened. The young one's voice was eager, slightly off-pitch in places, rushing the timing, learning, trying, alive. Marcus adjusted the parabolic dish, fine-tuning the aim. The vocalization became sharper, more focused. He could hear the breathing between phrases now, deep, controlled exhalations. He could hear the slight rustle that suggested movement, weight shifting. And then, just for a moment, he heard something else, a percussive sound like hands, large hands, striking wood in a rhythm that matched the song. Drumming. Accompaniment. Marcus's hands trembled as he monitored the levels. He was recording something no one had ever captured before. Not grainy Patterson-Gimlin footage, not ambiguous footprints or thermal blobs. This was art. This was culture. This was proof. The song continued for 11 minutes. The adult sang 7 distinct phrases, each one repeated with variations, each one answered by the juvenile. Then, abruptly, both vocalizations stopped. Marcus heard a soft sound that might have been footsteps, something large moving carefully through undergrowth, receding to the northwest. Then silence. Marcus sat frozen, hardly breathing, for another 20 minutes. When nothing further occurred, he carefully shut down his equipment, packed it with trembling hands, and drove back to the station. He didn't sleep. Instead, he spent the hours until dawn, listening to the recording over and over, watching the waveforms paint their impossible story across his monitors. At 6:15 a.m., he picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd sworn he'd never call. Dr. Sarah Chen answered on the 3rd ring, her voice thick with sleep. "This better be good, Marcus. I need you to come to Olympic," he said. "And Sarah, you need to come alone. Don't tell anyone where you're going." There was a long pause. Sarah Chen was a linguistic anthropologist at Berkeley, one of the few academics who'd published cautiously positive papers on animal culture and proto-language. She'd also been Marcus's partner once, years ago, before career paths and disagreements about field ethics had pulled them apart. "What did you find?" she asked, and her voice was suddenly sharp, awake. I'm not sure, Marcus said, which was a lie. He was sure. He'd never been more sure of anything in his life, but I think you'll want to hear it in person. Sarah arrived 36 hours later, driving straight through from California in her battered Subaru. Marcus met her in the parking lot as fog rolled in from the Pacific, turning the forest into a study in grey gradients. She looked the same. Dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the slight frown of someone perpetually evaluating evidence, and different, older, more cautious maybe, or just more tired. "Show me," she said, bypassing any greeting. In his lab, Marcus played her the recordings, not just the new one from his night at Owl Creek, but Bill's original cassette as well. Sarah stood motionless behind his chair, her expression unreadable as the vocalizations filled the small room. He watched her reflection in the dark window, the slight widening of her eyes, the way her hand came up to cover her mouth, the subtle shift in her posture from skeptical to stunned. When the recordings ended, she said nothing for a long moment. "Play the fourth phrase again," she said finally, "the one where the juvenile responds twice." Marcus isolated the segment and replayed it. The adult sang a descending melody, starting high and dropping through what sounded like a minor scale. The juvenile responded, got it wrong, paused, then tried again. Closer this time, but still not quite matching the adult's tonal precision. "Error correction," Sarah whispered. "The young one is learning. This isn't instinctive. It's transmitted." "I know. Marcus, do you understand what this means? If this is real, it's real." Sarah turned to face him, and in her expression he saw the same thing he'd been wrestling with for 3 days, the enormousness of it, the responsibility, the danger. "We can't publish this," she said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." "I know that too." They stood in the quiet lab, the weight of the secret settling between them like a physical presence. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, obscuring the forest. Somewhere out there, in the dense undergrowth and towering trees, someone was teaching someone else to sing. Someone was transmitting culture, knowledge, memory. Someone was parenting. "We need more," Sarah said. "More recordings, context. We need to understand what they're singing about." Marcus nodded. "There's something else," he said. He pulled up the spectrographic analysis of the adult's vocalizations, pointing to specific patterns in the harmonic structure. "See these dips in frequency, these pauses? I think the adult is exhausted or sick. The vocal quality degrades as the song continues. There's strain in the higher harmonics." Sarah leaned closer to the screen, her shoulder nearly touching his. "Play it again. The whole thing." He did. This time, listening with Sarah's observation in mind, Marcus heard it clearly. The adult voice grew rougher as each song progressed, the pitch less stable, the timing more effortful. And underneath it all, that acoustic signature of grief became more pronounced. "The adult is teaching while it still can," Sarah said softly. "This is about legacy." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You think the adult is dying?" "I think," Sarah said, "that we're listening to someone trying to pass on everything important before time runs out. These aren't just lullabies, Marcus. They're inheritance songs." The decision to attempt direct observation rather than just acoustic monitoring came after a week of ethical debate that left both Marcus and Sarah exhausted. They'd spent long nights in Marcus's office, mapping out protocols, constructing safeguards, arguing about consent in the context of non-human persons who couldn't formally agree to be studied. Sarah had brought her field ethics textbook from Berkeley, but they'd quickly discovered that all the carefully constructed guidelines for anthropological research assumed a shared language for negotiating boundaries. What do you do when the subjects of your study exist in folklore? When contacting them might endanger them, but not contacting them might mean losing the last chance to understand them before they disappeared. "We approach with humility," Sarah had said finally, around 3 a.m. on the 6th night. "We make ourselves visible, we don't hide, we let them decide whether to engage. And if they don't, then we have our answer. and we leave them alone. Now, at dusk on a cold November evening, they were implementing that protocol. They'd returned to Site 7 at Owl Creek, but this time they'd set up camp in the clearing itself, making no effort at concealment. Marcus's recording equipment was arranged on its tripods in plain sight. They'd built a small, contained fire in a portable steel ring, not for cooking but for light, and as a signal of deliberate presence. Next to the fire, Sarah had laid out objects she'd selected with care: a field notebook and pencil, a small mirror, several pieces of dried fruit, and a pictographic card she'd made showing simple symbols: human figure, tree, hand, question mark. "We're assuming they understand symbolic representation," Marcus had said when she'd shown him the card. "All great apes understand pictures to some degree," Sarah had replied. "And if these beings have culture complex enough for inheritance songs, they have symbolic capacity." The singing started at 8:43 p.m., earlier than previous recordings. It came from the same northwest direction, but closer. Marcus estimated less than 100 yards. The melody was the same descending pattern from before, and again the juvenile voice answered. But tonight there was a difference. The adult's vocalization ended with a new element, a rising interrogative contour that Marcus's trained ear recognized immediately. "That's a question," he said quietly. "The pitch pattern. It's the same structure you hear in question intonations across multiple language families." Sarah was already on her feet, moving slowly to position herself between the fire and the sound's origin. She raised both hands, palms forward, in what she hoped was a universal gesture of openness. Then she sang. Marcus's breath caught. Sarah had a clear, untrained voice, and she was singing a simple melody, just 5 notes, descending and then rising, repeated twice. It was based on the pattern they'd heard in the recordings, but simplified, stripped down to its essential structure. It was what a linguist might call a contact phrase, something simple enough to be imitated, complex enough to signal intentionality. An answer. For a long moment, there was only the crackling of the fire and the endless whisper of the forest. Then, impossibly, the adult voice sang back, the same 5-note pattern Sarah had used, rendered in that deep, resonant voice with its subsonic undertones. Not mocking, not hostile, acknowledging. Sarah sang again, this time with a slight variation. 6 notes instead of 5. The response came more quickly now, matching her variation. They were establishing a protocol, Marcus realized. A pigeon made of pure sound, testing the boundaries of mutual comprehension. Then the juvenile voice joined in, higher and more eager, and Marcus heard something that made his eyes sting. The young one was clearly excited by this exchange, rushing its phrases, adding extra flourishes. The adult vocalization that followed was shorter, almost sharp, corrective, Marcus thought, teaching patience. Sarah very slowly sat down cross-legged near the fire and continued the vocal exchange, gradually introducing new elements, repetitions, pauses of specific duration, responses that deliberately matched or deliberately varied what she'd heard. It was the most basic level of communicative scaffolding, but it was working. After 20 minutes, a pattern had emerged. Specific melodic contours seemed to indicate questions, others indicated confirmation, still others indicated negation or uncertainty. Then Sarah stopped singing and instead spoke in a soft, measured voice. "We hear you. We want to understand. We won't harm you." The forest went silent. Marcus's heart hammered. Had they moved too fast, broken the fragile thread of contact? Then he heard it. Footsteps. Not trying to be silent now, but moving with careful deliberation through the undergrowth, coming closer. From the darkness beyond the firelight, a figure emerged. Marcus had spent years preparing himself for this moment in theory, but theory meant nothing when confronted with the reality. The being was massive. He estimated 8 feet tall, perhaps more, with shoulders broad enough to suggest enormous strength. The body was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair, denser around the shoulders and back, sparser on the chest and face. The face itself stopped Marcus's breath. It was a hybrid of human and ape features, with a heavy brow ridge, a broad, flat nose, and a jaw that protruded slightly, but not to the degree of other great apes. But the eyes were what destroyed any lingering doubt about personhood. They were dark, deeply set, and filled with an intelligence that was unmistakable. And they were afraid. The being, Marcus found himself thinking of the adult as he, though there was no way to be certain, stood at the edge of the firelight, one massive hand resting against a hemlock trunk as if for support. The firelight revealed details Marcus's scientific mind catalogued even through his awe. The hair was grizzled with grey around the face and shoulders, the posture slightly stooped, the breathing audible and laboured. Sarah had been right. This individual was not well. Behind the adult, partially concealed in shadow, a smaller figure hovered, the juvenile. Marcus caught only glimpses: narrower shoulders, darker hair, without the grey grizzling, eyes that reflected the firelight like a night animal's. Sarah had frozen in her sitting position, but now she slowly reached for the pictographic card she'd prepared. She held it up, so the firelight illuminated the simple images: the human figure, the tree, the hand, the question mark. Then she pointed to herself, to Marcus, to the trees around them. She was trying to establish referential communication. These symbols correspond to these things. The adult watched for a long moment. Then, moving with surprising grace despite his size, he approached the fire ring. Marcus noticed that the being favoured his left leg slightly, a limp or injury, or perhaps just age. He stopped about 10 feet from Sarah, towering over her seated form, but making no aggressive gesture. Instead, he lowered himself slowly into a sitting position that mirrored hers, and Marcus saw the slight wince as he bent his legs. Definitely injured, or arthritic, or both. The juvenile hung back, emitting soft sounds, not words, but vocalizations of anxiety or uncertainty. The adult turned his head and sang a short phrase, gentle but firm. The juvenile quieted. Then the adult looked back at Sarah and extended one hand. The palm was pale, nearly human in color, and touched his own chest. He sang a short, two-note phrase. Then he pointed to the juvenile in the shadows and sang a different two-note phrase, higher in pitch. Names, Marcus realized with a jolt. He was giving them names, or at least vocal identifiers. Sarah responded by touching her own chest and saying clearly, "Sarah," then pointing to Marcus, "Marcus." The adult tilted his head, considering. Then he produced an approximation of Sarah. The sibilant S was challenging for him, coming out more as a soft H sound, but the vowels and rhythm were recognizable. He tried Marcus next, with similar results. Marku. They were communicating. Actual, intentional, bilateral communication with a species that wasn't supposed to exist. Sarah slowly reached for her field notebook and pencil. She made a simple sketch, a stick figure with long hair, representing the adult, and a smaller stick figure beside it, the juvenile. She held it up, then sang the two-note phrases the adult had used for their names, pointing to the corresponding figures in her drawing. The adult leaned forward, studying the sketch with intense focus. Then he reached out. Sarah had to steel herself not to flinch as that enormous hand approached, and gently took the pencil from her. His fingers were thick, the fine motor control clearly challenging, but he managed to grip the pencil and make marks on the paper. What he drew was crude but unmistakable, a cluster of simple figures, perhaps 7 or 8, arranged in a group. He pointed to one figure that was larger than the others and sang the two-note phrase for himself. Then he pointed to the smallest figure and sang the juvenile's name. The other figures he left unmarked, but he made a gesture with his hand, sweeping across them, and his vocalization changed. It became lower, rougher, ending in a sound that reminded Marcus of wind through empty caves. Gone. The other beings in the drawing were gone. Sarah's hand trembled as she took the notebook back. "Your family," she said softly, though she knew he couldn't understand the words. She pointed to the cluster of figures, then made a questioning melodic contour. The adult sang a long, complex phrase that rose and fell in what Marcus now recognized as the grief signature. Then he pointed to himself, to the juvenile, and held up 2 fingers on his massive hand. 2 left. Marcus felt tears on his face and didn't bother to wipe them away. He checked his recording equipment, still running, still capturing everything, and was simultaneously grateful and horrified that this moment was being preserved. How do you witness the end of a people? What right did he have to document this extinction in progress? The juvenile finally emerged more fully from the shadows, drawn by curiosity or need. Marcus was certain now that the young one was female. Something in the proportions and the pitch of her voice was perhaps 5.5 feet tall, slender, with large dark eyes that fixed on Sarah with an intensity that suggested she was processing everything about this encounter. She moved to her father's. Yes, father, that's what he was, sighed and pressed against him. He wrapped one long arm around her, a gesture of protection that was achingly familiar. Sarah pointed to the dried fruit she'd laid out and made an offering gesture. The adult considered, then carefully selected a piece of dried apple. He sniffed it, examined it, then broke it in half and gave one piece to the juvenile. They ate slowly, watching the humans with cautious attention. For the next 2 hours, they built a vocabulary of gestures and sounds. Sarah and the adult, Marcus had started thinking of him as elder, for lack of a better term, established signs for basic concepts: yes, no, danger, safe, food, water. The juvenile, whom Sarah dubbed Singer in her notes, watched everything with fierce concentration, occasionally repeating a gesture or sound to test her understanding. Elder's breathing grew more labored as the night progressed. At one point he touched his own chest and made a sound that Marcus recognized from his earlier recordings, a wheezing, crackling note that suggested fluid in the lungs. Pneumonia, maybe, or heart failure. Without medical intervention, without antibiotics or diagnostics, Elder was dying. That much was clear, and he knew it. Around midnight, Singer yawned, a very human gesture that made Marcus smile despite the gravity of the situation. Elder noticed and sang the descending melody that had started all of this, the inheritance song. Singer responded, but her version was sleepier, less focused. Elder corrected her gently, then sang it again. She tried once more, getting it nearly right this time. Elder touched her head in what could only be called affection. Then he turned to Sarah and performed an action that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. Elder pointed to Sarah, then to himself, then to Singer. He took Sarah's hand, his palm was warm, calloused, undeniably real, and placed it on Singer's head. Then he sang a phrase with a rising, questioning contour. Sarah understood. Marcus understood. They all understood. Elder was asking them to remember, to bear witness, to somehow hold the knowledge of his people after he was gone. Yes, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. Yes, we'll remember. I promise. Elder seemed to accept this, though whether he understood the words or simply the tone, Marcus couldn't say. He stood slowly, pulling Singer up with him. Before retreating back into the forest, he approached the fire ring once more and picked up one of the sticks Sarah had placed there, a simple piece of cedar about 18 inches long. He examined it, then used his thick fingernail to scratch marks into the soft wood, a series of lines and symbols that might have been decorative or might have been meaningful. He handed the marked stick to Sarah, then touched his chest, then Singer's chest, then Sarah's chest. A chain of connection. Then Elder and Singer disappeared into the darkness, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire and Sarah's quiet sobbing. Marcus let the recording run for another hour, but there were no more vocalizations that night, just the wind and the river, and 2 humans trying to comprehend what they'd witnessed. They returned to Site 7 every night for the next week, but Elder and Singer never came to the fire again. They were still there, though, Marcus caught their vocalizations in the distance, the inheritance songs transmitted night after night, growing slightly more confident in Singer's voice and slightly weaker in Elder's. Sarah spent her days analyzing the cedar stick Elder had marked, photographing it from every angle, comparing the symbols to rock art patterns from indigenous cultures throughout the Pacific Northwest, finding similarities but no exact matches. The marked stick was its own grammar, its own history, irreducible to any existing system of meaning. On the 8th night, something changed. Marcus and Sarah were at their now familiar positions near the fire when they heard sounds that didn't belong to the nightly song. Shouting human voices, the baying of dogs, the mechanical hum of ATVs, poachers or thrill-seekers, drawn by rumors that always seemed to spread no matter how careful you were. Marcus's blood went cold. "Kill the fire," he said, already moving to douse the flames with dirt. "We have to lead them away." But before they could act, Singer crashed through the undergrowth into the clearing. She was alone and terrified. She vocalized urgently, short, sharp phrases that needed no translation. Danger, help, follow. Sarah grabbed the emergency medical kit Marcus always brought for fieldwork. Basic supplies, antibiotics, painkillers, nothing that could treat serious trauma, but better than nothing. Marcus snatched up a high-powered flashlight and his radio. Then they followed Singer into the forest, moving as quickly as the darkness and terrain allowed. Singer led them northwest, moving with desperate speed, looking back constantly to ensure they were following. The sounds of the intruders grew more distant. Singer was deliberately taking them away from the human activity. After 20 minutes of hard travel, they reached a place Marcus had never seen. A steep hillside where a massive western red cedar had fallen decades ago, creating a root ball cavity large enough to serve as a shelter. Inside, barely visible in the shadows, was Elder. He was lying on his side on a bed of cedar boughs, his breathing rapid and shallow. Even in the dim glow of Marcus's flashlight, it was clear that Elder had declined dramatically in just a week. His eyes were half closed, his skin, visible through the thinner hair on his face and chest, had a greyish cast, and a wet, rattling sound accompanied each breath. Singer pressed herself against Elder's side, making soft, distressed vocalizations. Elder opened his eyes fully when he saw Sarah and Marcus, and something like recognition, or perhaps relief, crossed his face. Sarah knelt at the entrance to the root cavity. "Marcus, I need light. Close. Can you rig something?" Marcus positioned the flashlight on a rock, angling it to illuminate Elder's upper body. Sarah opened the medical kit with shaking hands. She had a nursing background from her early 20s, prerequisites for her anthropology fieldwork, but this was beyond any wilderness first aid scenario she'd trained for. Still, she had to try. "Respiratory distress," she murmured, more to herself than Marcus. "Fever, probably. Pneumonia advanced to critical stage." She pulled out the broad-spectrum antibiotics, azithromycin the only thing they had, and looked at Elder helplessly. How do you explain medication to someone who shares no language with you? How do you dose a being whose physiology you can only guess at? Singer watched Sarah with those large, intelligent eyes, then gently took her father's hand. She sang to him, the inheritance song, but softer, more tender. Elder's breathing eased slightly, his eyes focusing on his daughter. Then he looked at Sarah and made a gesture, taking, swallowing. He understood. Or perhaps he simply trusted. Sarah crushed the tablets, mixed them with a small amount of water to create a suspension, and held it out. Elder, with Singer's help, managed to raise his head enough to drink. He grimaced at the taste but swallowed it all. Sarah followed with water, then ibuprofen for the fever, estimating dosage based on his body mass and hoping it wouldn't be too little or dangerously too much. Then there was nothing more she could do, except keep him warm. She and Marcus brought their sleeping bags from camp, carefully draping them over Elder's massive frame. Singer curled against her father, and for a moment Marcus saw them not as cryptids or research subjects, but simply as what they were, a dying parent and a frightened child. The sounds of the intruders had faded, but Marcus knew they'd be back. People like that always came back. He pulled out his radio and called Bill Tanner, speaking in careful code they'd established. "Need you to run interference at the Owl Creek trailhead. Some traffic heading into the area. Can you redirect? How long you need?" Bill's voice crackled back. Marcus looked at Elder's labored breathing, at Singer's terrified face. "All night, maybe longer. Consider it done." Elder rallied briefly around 3 a.m., his fever breaking in a drenching sweat that soaked through the sleeping bags. He opened his eyes fully and saw Sarah sitting nearby, keeping watch. He gestured weakly for her to come closer. When she knelt beside him, he took her hand and placed it over his heart. She could feel the irregular, struggling rhythm beneath his sternum. Then he took Singer's hand and placed it over Sarah's hand, creating a chain. He sang a phrase one Marcus hadn't heard before that started low and rose in a spiral of notes that seemed to carry both sorrow and hope. Singer repeated it, her voice cracking with emotion. Elder made an approving sound, then gestured to Sarah. "Your turn." Sarah sang it back, stumbling over the notes, getting the pitch wrong in places. Elder and Singer corrected her patiently, and they repeated the phrase together until Sarah had it memorized. It felt sacred, this transmission. It felt like being entrusted with something infinitely precious. Then Elder reached for the cedar stick he'd marked days earlier. Singer had brought it with them, Marcus realized. Elder held it up to Sarah, then pointed to the symbols he'd carved. He sang the new phrase while pointing to one symbol. Then he sang another phrase, one from the earlier inheritance songs, while pointing to a different symbol. He was giving her a key. A Rosetta Stone. The symbols were mnemonic devices for the songs, Marcus realized. They were musical notation, or something like it. A way to preserve the songs beyond memory. "We'll keep them safe," Sarah promised, taking the stick with trembling hands. "We'll remember all of it." Elder seemed satisfied. He turned to Singer and sang to her for a long time, teaching, correcting, praising. Marcus recognized some of the phrases from previous nights, but there were new ones too. Elder was accelerating the transmission, packing years of cultural knowledge into hours, because he knew he didn't have years. Singer absorbed it all with fierce concentration, repeating each phrase until she had it perfect. As dawn began to gray the sky beyond the root cavity, Elder's breathing changed. It became slower, more regular, the breathing of someone letting go. Singer understood what was happening. Her vocalizations took on a keening quality that tore at Marcus's heart. She pressed her face against her father's chest, and Elder wrapped his arms around her one last time. He looked at Sarah and Marcus, his eyes clear for one final moment. Then he sang a single note, pure, sustained, resonant, that seemed to fill the entire forest. Singer joined him, their voices blending in a final duet. The note held, and gradually Elder's voice faded until only Singer's remained, alone, singing into the silence her father left behind. Elder's eyes closed. His breathing stopped, and just like that, the population of his people dropped from 2 to 1. Singer wouldn't leave her father's body. She sat beside him through the morning, occasionally touching his face, singing fragments of the inheritance songs in a voice raw with grief. Sarah and Marcus gave her space, keeping watch from the clearing's edge. Around noon, Bill Tanner appeared, having successfully diverted the intruders to a different sector of the forest. "The game warden's asking questions," Bill said quietly to Marcus. "Somebody reported unusual sounds, got people curious." "Tell them it was elk bugling out of season," Marcus said. "Sound carries weird in this valley." "Already did." Bill glanced toward the root cavity. "How bad?" "The adult died at dawn. The juvenile is still here. Bill, we have a situation. She's alone now. Marcus struggled to find words. "She's the last one." Bill's weathered face creased with pain. He'd spent 40 years in these forests, had always suspected there was something more out there in the deep woods. Now the confirmation came wrapped in tragedy. "What do you need?" "Time. Distance. This location needs to be off limits. No trail access. No exceptions. And if anyone asks about our research, we're studying owl populations. That's all. I can do that. Stations willing to close this whole drainage for spotted owl habitat recovery. Got the paperwork started last week, soon as you called me the first time. Bill looked at Marcus seriously. You knew this could go bad, didn't you? I hoped it wouldn't. I hoped. Marcus stopped. What had he hoped? That they could study an undiscovered species without consequences. That contact could be made without risk. I hoped we'd have more time. Singer finally emerged from the root cavity in the late afternoon. She was carrying several objects Marcus hadn't noticed before. More carved sticks, a woven mat of cedar bark, and a stone that had been shaped into a roughly spherical form with deliberate grinding. She looked at Sarah with an expression that needed no translation. Help me. Together, human and... what did you call her? Not ape? Not human. Something else. Something between or beyond. They gathered cedar boughs and arranged them over Elder's body. Singer sang as they worked, and Sarah hummed along, following the melody as best she could. Marcus documented it with his audio recorder, knowing that this funeral rite might be the last of its kind ever performed, and hating himself for knowing it. When Elder was covered, Singer placed the carved sticks and the stone on top of the boughs. Then she stood for a long moment, her hand resting on the mound, before finally turning away. She looked at Sarah and Marcus and made a gesture they'd established nights before. Follow me. Singer led them deeper into the forest, moving northwest into terrain so rugged and remote that Marcus doubted more than a handful of humans had ever seen it. They climbed through old growth, crossed streams on fallen logs, scrambled up rock faces where Singer had to help pull them over difficult sections. Her strength, even in grief, was astonishing. After 2 hours, they reached a place that made Marcus's breath catch. A small box canyon with walls too steep to climb without technical gear, accessible only through a narrow cleft, barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through. Inside, the canyon opened into a hidden valley, perhaps 2 acres in size, with a small spring-fed creek and a grove of ancient trees. And in the trees, Marcus saw structures. Not buildings exactly, but arrangements. Platforms of woven branches, windbreaks of stacked stone, fire-blackened rocks arranged in circles. This had been a living place, a home place. Singer showed them everything: grinding stones for processing food, digging sticks with fire-hardened points, baskets woven from cedar root with patterns that varied. Individual styles, Marcus realized, different hands creating different designs. And in a sheltered overhang, pictographs, handprints in red ochre, symbol strings like those on Elder's stick, and images of figures that looked like Singer's people, tall, powerful, part of the forest. This was their last refuge, Marcus understood. The place they'd retreated to as their population dwindled, the place Singer had been born most likely, and where she'd been raised by Elder after the others, her mother, siblings, extended family, had died or disappeared. Singer touched the pictographs gently, singing names. Each symbol cluster seemed to represent an individual. Marcus counted 12, 12 down to 2 down to 1. Then Singer sat down on a flat rock near the spring and looked at Sarah with an expression of such profound loneliness that Sarah moved without thinking, sitting beside her and taking her hand. Singer leaned against her, and Sarah held her as the young one cried, deep, shuddering sounds that were unmistakably weeping. Marcus turned away, giving them privacy, and found himself looking at the canyon walls. Singer would be safe here, he thought. The location was remote enough, defensible enough. With the drainage officially closed, with Bill running interference, they could protect this place. But protection meant secrecy, and secrecy meant Singer would live her entire life alone. No mate, no children, no future. The last song would end with her. They established a protocol over the following weeks. Sarah and Marcus visited the hidden canyon every 3 days, bringing supplies Singer might need. Dried foods, blankets, a first aid kit adapted for her physiology based on educated guesses. In return, Singer continued teaching them. She expanded their vocabulary of gestures and sounds. She showed them how her people processed food, built shelters, read the forest, and she sang. Every visit ended with singing. Sarah had recorded all the inheritance songs by now, had transcribed them using a notation system she'd created specifically for singers' vocalizations. She'd matched most of the symbols on the carved sticks to specific melodic phrases. The songs encoded practical knowledge, seasonal patterns, food sources, danger warnings, but also stories. Creation stories, maybe, or historical accounts. The meanings were still murky, but the structure was clear. This was how Singer's people had preserved their culture across generations. And now Sarah and Marcus were the only other ones who knew it. The ethical weight was crushing. They documented an undiscovered species, confirmed its intelligence and culture, recorded its language and traditions. In any other context, this would be the discovery of the century, worthy of immediate publication, global recognition. But publication meant exposure, and exposure meant destruction. The only thing keeping Singer alive and safe was that the world didn't know she existed. "We're complicit in an extinction," Marcus said one night in his lab, staring at months of recordings. "We're watching the last member of a people die, and we're doing nothing." "We're doing the only thing we can," Sarah replied. "We're bearing witness. We're keeping faith. If we expose her, she becomes a specimen, a curiosity, a thing to be captured and studied and locked away. This way, she's free, she's living on her own terms. For how long? Singer's young, maybe early 20s by our guess, but she's alone. One accident, one illness, one bad winter, and—" "I know," Sarah's voice broke. "I know, Marcus. But I also know that we promised. We promised Elder we'd remember, not that we'd save them. Some species can't be saved. Some extinctions are already in motion before we even know to grieve." Marcus looked at the cedar stick they kept locked in a secure drawer, at the photographs of pictographs, at the waveforms of inheritance songs frozen on his monitors. "Then what's the point? What good is remembering if it doesn't change anything?" "The point," Sarah said quietly, "is that they deserve to be remembered as people, not as monsters or myths. When Singer dies," she had to pause, collecting herself. "When she dies, and this is over, maybe we can tell the story. Not with coordinates or DNA samples or proof, just the story. That there were people here, in these forests, and they loved and sang and passed their knowledge to their children. That they existed, that they mattered." December brought the first serious snow, and Marcus worried, but Singer managed. She'd shown them her winter preparations, a deep cache of dried salmon, camas bulbs, and acorn meal, a weatherproof shelter reinforced with bark and moss, a supply of fire-making materials. She'd learned from Elder, and Elder had learned from his elders on back through enough generations that the knowledge was refined by survival. On the winter solstice, Marcus and Sarah made the difficult trek to the hidden canyon through 2 feet of new snow. They found Singer in good health, sheltered and warm. She'd been practicing the inheritance songs. They could hear her as they approached, and when she saw them, she sang a new melody they hadn't heard before. It was the song of greeting, Sarah realized. Singer had composed it herself, creating new culture even as the old culture died. She was adapting. She was carrying on. They shared a meal by Singer's fire, dried salmon that she'd smoked herself, root vegetables from Sarah's pack, and huckleberries they'd collected and preserved in the fall. Singer demonstrated how she'd been working on new carved sticks, adding her own symbols to the tradition Elder had taught her. She was documenting her own life, Marcus understood, creating a record that would outlast her. After the meal, Singer gestured for Sarah's notebook. She'd learned to recognize it as a thing for storing knowledge. Sarah handed it over, and Singer carefully sketched a series of images, the stick figures representing her family, but arranged now in a pattern that suggested genealogy. She drew lines connecting figures, used different marks to indicate relationships. Then she drew herself at the bottom of the tree, alone, but with a line extending from her that ended in a symbol, the question mark Sarah had shown her that first night. Who will come after? Sarah took the notebook with shaking hands and drew two figures, herself and Marcus. She drew a line from Singer to their figures, not a bloodline, but a connection nonetheless. Then she drew an open circle around all three figures and added marks radiating outward. A network, a promise. Not children, not biological continuity, but witness, memory, legacy of a different kind. Singer studied the drawing for a long time. Then she touched Sarah's face gently. Her fingers were rough, calloused, real, and sang a phrase of acknowledgement. She understood. It wasn't the future any of them would have chosen, but it was the future they had. As Marcus and Sarah prepared to leave, Singer gave them a gift, a small basket she'd woven from cedar bark, the pattern intricate and beautiful. Inside was a single carved stone, smooth and perfectly round, with symbols etched into its surface. It was like the stone she'd placed on Elder's grave, Marcus realized. She was giving them a memorial object, a reminder. They accepted it with the reverence it deserved. Epilogue: The Ethics of Silence. 3 years have passed as I write this. Sarah and I still visit Singer every week when the weather allows, less frequently in the hard winter months. She's learned more English, or at least more of our gesture vocabulary, and we've learned more of her song language. We have 17 hours of recordings now, 3 notebooks full of Sarah's linguistic analysis, and hundreds of photographs of the hidden canyon and its artifacts. We've published nothing. We've told no one except Bill Tanner, who maintains the closure of the drainage and fends off the occasional hiker or researcher who wants access. The official records state it's critical spotted owl habitat. In a way, that's not even a lie. There are spotted owls there, and the habitat is critical, just not for the reasons listed. Singer is 24 now, by our best estimate. She's healthy, resourceful, and as far as we can tell, content with her solitary life. She's continued Elder's tradition of innovation, developing new techniques for food preservation, creating art on bark panels, expanding the pictographic record in the canyon. She teaches us constantly, patient with our clumsy attempts to understand her world. But she's alone, profoundly, irrevocably alone, in a way that no being with consciousness and culture should have to be. We've debated our choice 10,000 times. Should we have gone public? Could genetic sampling have found other populations? Could captive breeding programs have been established? The answer is always the same: no. Singer's people were already functionally extinct when we found them. Elder was old, likely sterile or close to it. Singer is genetically unique, but one individual cannot repopulate a species, and the moment the world knew they existed, Singer would have become property, captured, studied, institutionalized. She would have spent the rest of her life in a facility, however comfortable, however well-meaning. This way, she's free. This way, she's a person, not a specimen. When she dies, and we try not to think about that, but we have to be realistic, Sarah and I have agreed on a plan. We'll document the location of the hidden canyon for posterity, but we'll seal the records for 100 years. We'll publish the linguistic analysis and cultural observations, but stripped of geographic specifics. We'll tell the story of what we witnessed, but as an unverifiable account. People will call it fiction. They'll call us liars or dreamers, and maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the last survivors of a hidden people deserve to pass into mystery rather than science. Maybe Singer and Elder and the others deserve to be remembered in songs and stories rather than in peer-reviewed journals. The inheritance songs will survive. Sarah has taught them to her niece, who has a gift for music. I've hidden copies of the recordings in 3 separate, secure locations. The carved sticks are in a safe deposit box, catalogued and photographed. When the time comes, when enough time has passed that it can't hurt anyone, the songs will be shared. And maybe someone will sing them and understand what they mean, that we shared this world with another people, that they lived with grace and dignity in the places we call wilderness, that they loved their children and taught them everything important and tried desperately to survive even when survival became impossible. Maybe someone will sing them and understand that we failed them, that we arrived too late, with too little to offer except our presence and our promise to remember. Last week, Singer sang me a new composition, her own creation, not elders. It was the story of the inheritance songs themselves. How knowledge passes from one generation to the next, how it changes but persists, how it carries the weight of all who came before. She was singing about her own extinction, I realized. She was making art about being the last. When she finished, I told her what I always tell her. In the mixed language we've created together, you are not forgotten. You will never be forgotten. She touched her chest, then mine, then pointed to the forest around us. She sang a single phrase, a question. Will they remember the forest too? Will they remember all of it? I don't know how to answer that. The forests are being logged at the edges of protected zones. Climate change is shifting habitats. The world Singer's people adapted to over millennia is transforming faster than any species can keep up. Maybe the inheritance songs are all that will remain. Recordings of a people singing about a world that no longer exists. But for now, in this moment, Singer is alive. The songs are alive. The hidden canyon holds its secrets, and two humans keep faith with a promise made to a dying father. We will bear witness. We will remember. We will hold the grief of this extinction in our hearts and do the only thing we can do with it, refuse to let them disappear completely. Every 3 days, we make the journey. Every 3 days, we sit with the last of her kind. And every 3 days, she teaches us something new about what it means to be a person in this world, regardless of species. The recordings will outlast us all. The songs will echo in secure archives long after Singer is gone, after Sarah and I are gone, after everyone who walked this earth in our time has returned to it. And maybe, centuries from now, someone will listen and understand that they're hearing the voice of a person who was almost forgotten. We won't let that happen. Elder asked us to remember, and we will. Not as scientists claiming a discovery, not as researchers publishing data, but as witnesses who sat by a fire with people from another branch of the human family tree and learned that kinship is wider, deeper, and more tragic than we ever imagined. The inheritance songs will survive. They have to. They're all that's left. The forest remembers what we forget. The songs remember what the forest cannot say. And somewhere in the space between sound and silence, between witness and wonder, a people existed who sang their children into understanding. This is their story. This is their legacy. Listen. Want more stories that blend wonder with heartbreak, science with soul? Subscribe to our channel for speculative fiction that remembers what we're losing and celebrates what endures. New stories every week, because some voices deserve to echo forever.